April 15th, 1943. The submarine USS Barracuda had been missing for 72 hours in enemy waters, and the entire Pacific Fleet had given up hope of ever finding her crew alive. But what Navy Command didn't know was that the grizzled old veteran they'd been mocking in the training barracks had once commanded that very vessel through the most impossible rescue mission in naval history. Could the stories they dismissed as senile ramblings actually hold the key to bringing those sailors home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of the Naval Training Station San Diego flickered overhead as Commander Patricia Hendricks reviewed the personnel files spread across her desk. It was 1985, and the Cold War had transformed naval warfare into something her predecessors would barely recognize. Sonar technology, nuclear propulsion, computerized targeting systems. The modern Navy bore little resemblance to the diesel-powered submarines that had prowled the Pacific 4 decades earlier. A knock interrupted her concentration. "Enter," she called, without looking up. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Bellamy stepped through the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. Behind him shuffled an elderly man in an ill-fitting civilian jacket, his shoulders slightly hunched, but his eyes sharp and alert. "Commander, this is Walter Grissom," Bellamy announced. "He's our new historical warfare instructor. Arrived this morning from Washington." Hendricks finally glanced up, taking in the visitor's appearance. Grissom had to be pushing 70, with silver hair cropped military short and hands that trembled slightly at his sides. A small service ribbon pin adorned his lapel, the only indication of his naval past. "Mr. Grissom," she acknowledged with a brief nod, "your credentials came through last week. I understand you served on submarines during the war?" "Yes, ma'am. USS Barracuda, SS-220, 1942 through 45. His voice carried the gravelly texture of age, but his posture straightened as he spoke of his service. Hendricks noticed Bellamy's barely suppressed smirk. The chief had made his opinions clear during their earlier conversation, bringing in a relic from World War. To lecture modern submariners was a waste of everyone's time. "The recruits are waiting in Lecture Hall C," Hendricks said, returning her attention to the paperwork. "Chief Bellamy will show you the way. Your first session begins in 20 minutes. As they walked through the corridors of the training facility, Grissom's unsteady gait drew curious stares from passing sailors. Bellamy maintained a respectful distance, though his body language radiated skepticism. "The recruits can be energetic, sir," Bellamy offered as they approached the lecture hall. "They're young, bright, and they've been training on equipment that didn't exist in your day. Just letting you know what to expect." Grissom paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. "Son, I've faced Japanese destroyers in the middle of the Philippine Sea with nothing but prayer and diesel fumes. I think I can handle a room full of 20-year-olds. The lecture hall contained 43 recruits, their crisp uniforms and eager faces representing the Navy's future. They quieted as Grissom made his way to the podium, though whispers rippled through the ranks. "Is that the instructor? Guy looks like he belongs in a retirement home. What's he going to teach us? How to navigate with a sextant?" A scattered laughter followed. Grissom set down his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a yellowed photograph, which he clipped to the overhead projector. The image showed a submarine cutting through dark water, its conning tower bearing the number 220. "Good morning. I'm Walter Grissom, and 42 years ago I served aboard that vessel, the USS Barracuda." His voice carried clearly through the hall, stronger now than in Hendricks' office. "I'm here to share operational experiences from the Pacific Theater that might prove relevant to your training." A hand shot up in the third row. Seaman recruit Derek Paulson, according to the roster Grissom had reviewed. "Sir, with respect, how is World War II submarine warfare relevant to modern operations? We're training on Los Angeles-class attack subs with nuclear propulsion and digital fire control systems." "Valid question. Recruit Paulson, Grissom advanced the projector to show a tactical map of the Pacific. Tell me, when you're tracking an enemy vessel, what's your primary concern? Maintaining sonar contact while staying undetected. Paulson answered promptly, exactly the same priority we had in 1943. The technology changes, but the fundamental principles of submarine warfare remain constant. Your predators operating in an environment where a single mistake means death for your entire crew. Valid question, Recruit Paulson. Grissom advanced the projector to show a tactical map of the Pacific. Tell me, when you're tracking an enemy vessel, what's your primary concern? Maintaining sonar contact while staying undetected. Paulson answered promptly. Exactly the same priority we had in 1943. The technology changes, but the fundamental principles of submarine warfare remain constant. Your predators operating in an environment where a single mistake means death for your entire crew. Another recruit spoke up. Jennifer Kozlowski, her nameplate read. But sir, your submarines were so primitive. Diesel engines, manual calculations, periscopes instead of digital imaging. It's barely comparable. Primitive? Grissom's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement, perhaps. But that primitive technology took the Barracuda through 14 war patrols, sank 23 enemy vessels, and completed missions that current naval historians still classify as improbable. With all due respect, a voice from the back row. Seaman recruit Thomas Brighton. Those old war stories don't really apply anymore. My grandfather served in Vietnam, and even he says modern warfare is completely different. The comment triggered more laughter. Grissom noticed several recruits exchanging glances and eye rolls. One mimed falling asleep against his neighbor's shoulder. I see. Grissom clicked off the projector. So you believe there's nothing to learn from past operations? That experience counts for nothing compared to your textbooks and simulators? It's not that we don't respect your service, sir, Paulson said, his tone walking the line between courtesy and condescension. It's just, well, the gap between then and now is enormous. You're talking about completely different warfare. Grissom surveyed the room, reading the skepticism etched on young faces. These recruits had grown up with computers, satellite communications, and GPS navigation. To them, World War II was ancient history, as relevant as cavalry charges or wooden sailing ships. Let me ask you something, Grissom said quietly. How many of you have actually been underwater in a submarine? Not a simulator, the real thing. 3 hands rose hesitantly. And how many of you have experienced a depth charge attack? Heard the hull groaning as water pressure tests every weld? Felt the deck plates vibrate as enemy destroyers pass directly overhead while you pray they don't detect your position? Silence. I thought not. Grissom retrieved his briefcase. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you about one specific patrol, March 1943, in the waters near the Solomon Islands. You're going to listen, and afterward, we'll discuss whether anything I describe has relevance to modern submarine operations. Fair enough? A few nods, mostly out of politeness. The recruits settled into their seats with the resigned patience of students enduring a required lecture. The Barracuda left Pearl Harbor on March 8, 1943, Grissom began. Our mission was to patrol the shipping lanes between Rabaul and Truk, disrupting Japanese supply convoys. Our captain was Commander Raymond Atwood, finest officer I ever served under. Our executive officer was Lieutenant Franklin Marsh. I was a 26-year-old lieutenant junior grade, serving as torpedo officer. He moved away from the podium, pacing slowly across the front of the room. We'd been at sea for 11 days when we received an emergency communication. Another submarine, the USS Swordfish, had encountered a Japanese task force and taken damage during an engagement. She was running on emergency power, unable to dive below 50 feet, with enemy destroyers actively hunting her. The room remained quiet, though whether from interest or boredom, Grissom couldn't tell. The Swordfish's last known position was 140 miles from our location, deep in Japanese-controlled waters. Naval Command transmitted coordinates and gave Captain Atwood discretion on whether to attempt a rescue. The risk assessment was simple. We'd be sailing straight into the teeth of enemy defenses to locate a crippled submarine that might already be at the bottom of the ocean. Grissom paused, letting the scenario sink in. Captain Atwood called the senior officers to the wardroom. We had 20 minutes to decide our course of action. Lieutenant Marsh argued we should maintain our patrol mission. The Swordfish crew knew the risks when they enlisted, and sacrificing 2 submarines made no tactical sense. They remember his exact words. "We can't save everyone, sir." "That's the reality of war. What did your captain decide?" asked Kozlowski, her skepticism momentarily replaced by curiosity. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That," Grissom said, "is where our story really begins. But first I want you to consider what you would do in Captain Atwood's position. You're in command of a vessel with 63 souls aboard. You have a defined mission that serves the broader war effort. And you've just been asked to risk everything for a crew that might already be dead." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of several recruits. "Modern technology doesn't answer that question. Your sophisticated sonar and nuclear engines don't make that decision any easier. What Captain Atwood faced that morning is the same thing every submarine commander faces. How do you calculate the value of human life against mission objectives?" The lecture hall had grown noticeably quieter. Even Brighton in the back row had stopped his side conversation. "We'll continue this tomorrow," Grissom announced. "Tonight, I want each of you to write a 1-page analysis of what decision you would make and why. Bring it to our next session." As the recruits filed out, their conversations carried a different tone than their earlier mockery. Grissom heard fragments of debate, some arguing for the rescue attempt, others supporting mission priority. Chief Bellamy waited by the door. "That wasn't quite what I expected, sir." "What were you expecting, Chief?"
"Honestly,
"War stories about torpedo runs and depth charges." "The usual glory tales," Grissom smiled faintly. "The glory tales are easy, Chief. It's the decisions that keep you awake 40 years later that matter. Those recruits need to understand that long before they ever set foot in a real submarine." As they walked back through the corridors, neither man noticed Commander Hendricks standing in the back of the lecture hall, a thoughtful expression on her face. She'd arrived halfway through Grissom's session, expecting to observe a forgettable history lesson. Instead, she'd witnessed something different, an old submariner who understood that the real lessons of warfare had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with the weight of command. Tomorrow's session, she decided, would be worth attending from the beginning. The following morning, Lecture Hall C filled earlier than usual. Recruits arrived in clusters, still debating their written assignments. Grissom noticed several had brought coffee. They expected a longer session today. Commander Hendricks slipped into a seat in the back row, notepad in hand. Chief Bellamy stood near the door, arms crossed but posture attentive. Grissom waited until precisely 800 hours before speaking. "I reviewed your decision papers last night. 27 of you chose to continue the patrol mission. 16 voted for the rescue attempt. Interesting split." He gestured to the stack of papers on his desk. Recruit Brighton wrote that abandoning the Swordfish crew was the only logical choice, given resource constraints and strategic priorities. Well-reasoned argument. Brighton straightened slightly in his seat. Vindicated? Recruit Paulson countered that submarine crews represent specialized training and experience that take years to replace, making rescue economically justified. Grissom nodded toward Paulson. "Also solid reasoning. So which answer is correct, sir?" Kozlowski asked. "Neither. Both." Grissom moved to the map still displayed from yesterday. "War doesn't grade on a curve. Captain Atwood made his decision, and we lived with the consequences. Let me tell you what happened." The room settled into focused silence. Atwood gave us 45 seconds to voice objections. Lieutenant Marsh stood by his recommendation to maintain patrol. I remained silent. I was too junior to challenge the executive officer, and honestly, I wasn't sure what I believed. Atwood listened, then said 7 words that changed everything. Set course for the swordfish position. Grissom's voice dropped, pulling recruits forward in their seats. We surfaced after dark to make better speed. The Barracuda could manage 21 knots on the surface, but we were completely vulnerable. Every minute topside meant Japanese patrol aircraft could spot us, or worse, a destroyer's radar could paint us before we even knew they were there. Our radar operator, Sonarman Second Class Eugene Hartwell, stayed glued to his scope. At 2300 hours, he picked up aircraft radar signals, a patrol bomber sweeping the area, probably looking for the damaged swordfish. "Did you dive?" asked a recruit named Michael Cassidy from the front row. "Immediately. Crash dive took us down in 90 seconds, but it cost us speed. Submerged, we could barely make 9 knots, and we had 90 miles left to cover. Captain Atwood calculated we'd reach the swordfish's last position by 1400 hours the next day, assuming she was still afloat and hadn't drifted far." Grissom pulled out another photograph, this one showing the cramped interior of a submarine control room. Understand something about those diesel boats. You modern submariners have climate control, air recycling systems that can sustain you for months. We had battery-powered ventilation and carbon dioxide scrubbers that worked when they felt like it. After 6 hours submerged, the air gets thick. After 12 hours, you're breathing soup. We were underwater for 14 straight hours, and the temperature inside hit 98 degrees. He let that image settle before continuing. At 600 hours, a sonar operator picked up propeller signatures. Destroyer screws, the distinctive high-pitched whine of Japanese Fubuki-class warships. They were conducting a search pattern, methodical and thorough. We went running. What's silent running entail exactly? Brighton interrupted, pen poised over his notebook. Everything non-essential shuts down. No cooking, no unnecessary movement, speaking only in whispers. The entire crew becomes part of the boat, minimizing any sound that might give away our position. You barely breathe. I've seen men stand motionless for 3 hours, sweat pouring down their faces, because shifting their weight might cause a deck plate to creak. Grissom moved closer to the recruits, his voice barely above a conversational tone. The destroyers passed within 800 yards of our position, close enough that we could hear their propellers through the hull. Our sonar officer, Chief Lawrence Kimball, tracked 3 separate contacts. They were working a grid pattern, which meant they knew approximately where the swordfish had gone down, and they were making sure nothing else was in the area. "How did you get past them?" Paulson asked. "We didn't. We went under them." Grissom's eyes held a distant focus, seeing something beyond the lecture hall. Captain Atwood ordered us to 300 feet, 50 feet deeper than our official test depth. The hull started making noises that would give you nightmares. Metal groaning, rivets straining. Every man aboard knew we were pushing the boat beyond its design limits. The recruits had stopped taking notes. They simply listened. At that depth, we crept forward at 3 knots, barely moving. It took us 2 hours to clear the destroyer screen. When we finally eased back up to 150 feet, Chief Kimball reported no contacts. We were through. Grissom returned to the map, tracing a route with his finger. By 1330 hours, we'd reached the coordinates where the swordfish had transmitted her last message. Nothing on sonar. No debris field, no oil slick visible through the periscope. For 20 minutes, we conducted a spiral search pattern, expanding our radius. Captain Atwood's face showed nothing, but I could see his jaw clenching. We'd risked everything to reach a patch of empty ocean. "She'd already sunk." Kozlowski's voice carried genuine disappointment. "That's what we thought." Lieutenant Marsh recommended we surface, conduct a quick visual search, then resume our original patrol. Atwood agreed. We'd done everything possible. Then Kimball spoke up from the sonar station. "Sir, I'm picking up something odd. Bearing 270 range, approximately 4,000 yards. It's not propellers. More like metallic tapping." The lecture hall was absolutely still. We altered course toward the sound. As we approached, Kimball isolated the pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. SOS in Morse code. Someone was banging on a metal hull, and the sound was traveling through the water. Recruit Amanda Sterling, who'd been silent both sessions, spoke up. The swordfish was still intact? Barely. We found her resting on a ledge at 210 feet, her bow angled down at 15 degrees. Through the periscope we could see damage along her stern. She'd taken a torpedo hit that destroyed her aft compartments and jammed her diving planes. She'd settled on the bottom, too deep to surface, but not deep enough to crush. Grissom paused, letting the scenario unfold in the recruits' imaginations. Captain Atwood faced an impossible problem. The swordfish had 71 men aboard. We couldn't transfer them underwater. The pressure would kill them. We couldn't tow her to the surface. She was too damaged. And we couldn't stay in the area indefinitely. Those Japanese destroyers would return on their next sweep. What about calling for support? Cassidy suggested. Radio for rescue ships. Nearest Allied vessel was 8 hours away, and transmitting our position would bring every Japanese warship in the Solomon Islands down on us. Captain Atwood had to solve this with what he had, one functional submarine and a crew that was already exhausted. Grissom walked back to his desk, retrieved a technical schematic, and clipped it to the projector. This is a Gato-class submarine pressure hull schematic. Notice the forward torpedo room here. He pointed to the diagram. It has an escape trunk, essentially an airlock that allows personnel to enter and exit while submerged. Standard equipment for crew evacuation in emergencies. You transferred the crew through the escape trunks. Brighton's skepticism had evaporated, replaced by fascination. That was the theory. The reality was significantly more complicated. Grissom advanced to another diagram, showing the rescue procedure. Both submarines would need to be perfectly positioned, their escape trunks aligned. The Swordfish crew would have to flood their forward compartment, equalize pressure, then swim up to our trunk. In training, under controlled conditions, with experienced divers. Not with 71 exhausted submariners, some likely injured, in enemy waters. That sounds insane, Sterling said flatly. Lieutenant Marsh used stronger language. Grissom replied with a slight smile. He argued the procedure had never been attempted under combat conditions, that we'd likely lose both submarines in the attempt. He recommended we mark the position, surface and radio for proper rescue equipment, which would take how long? Paulson asked. Minimum 8 hours. Probably 12. The Swordfish had been down for 19 hours already. Their air supply was calculated for 72 hours maximum, but that assumed functional CO2 scrubbers and no flooding in additional compartments. Every hour we delayed reduced their survival chances exponentially. Grissom clicked off the projector. Captain Atwood called for volunteers. He needed 6 experienced swimmers to make the initial contact with the Swordfish, assess her condition, and prepare for the transfer. He'd lead the team himself. The recruits leaned forward collectively. I volunteered. So did Chief Kimball and 4 others from our crew. We had 1 hour to rig the equipment and plan the operation. 60 minutes to figure out something that naval engineers would later say should have required 6 months of preparation and testing. Hendricks, watching from the back, made a note in her margin. This is what they need to understand. Real decisions under impossible pressure. Tomorrow, Grissom said, I'll explain what happened. When we opened those hatches and discovered that everything we'd planned was wrong, dismissed. The recruits remained seated for several seconds before slowly gathering their belongings. Their conversations were subdued, focused. Brighton approached the podium. Sir, I need to apologize for yesterday. The comment about war stories was out of line. Grissom met his eyes. You spoke what you believed. That's not something to apologize for. But now you're listening, and that's what matters. As the hall emptied, Hendricks approached. Mr. Grissom, I'm moving tomorrow's session to the main auditorium. Word is spreading through the training station. I expect you'll have considerably more than 43 attendees. That won't be necessary, Commander. It wasn't a request, she replied. What you're teaching them goes beyond submarine tactics. They need to hear this. All of them. After she left, Chief Bellamy lingered. The Swordfish rescue. I looked it up in the historical archives last night. There's barely 2 paragraphs about it. Classified mission, most details still redacted. How much of what you're telling them actually happened? Grissom closed his briefcase without answering. Every word, Chief. Every single word. The main auditorium held 300 personnel, and every seat was occupied. Word had spread beyond the recruit training program. Seasoned officers, instructors, even maintenance crew filled the space. Commander Hendricks had been right about the interest. Grissom stood at the podium, momentarily taken aback by the crowd. Chief Bellamy gave him an encouraging nod from the wings. "I see we've attracted attention," Grissom began. "For those joining us today, we're discussing a rescue operation conducted in March 1943 involving two submarines, the USS Barracuda and the USS Swordfish. Yesterday, I described how we located the Swordfish on the ocean floor at 210 feet, damaged and unable to surface, with 71 men trapped inside, running out of air." He advanced the projector to show the technical diagram from the previous session. Captain Atwood's plan required precise maneuvering. We'd position the Barracuda directly above the Swordfish, align our forward escape trunk with theirs, and transfer the crew in groups of 4. Theoretically straightforward, but submarines aren't designed for precision hovering. We're built to move through water, not park in one spot. A voice called out from the middle rows. Lieutenant Gregory Nash, an instructor Grissom recognized from the facility roster. "What about ballast control? Could you adjust trim to maintain position?" "Good question." Our chief of the boat, Quartermaster First Class Vincent Moretti, was arguably the finest ballast operator in the Pacific Fleet. If anyone could hold us steady, it was Moretti. But even he couldn't account for ocean currents at that depth, or the Barracuda's tendency to drift in the thermocline layer. Grissom moved away from the podium, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's acoustics. We began the approach at 16:15 hours. Captain Atwood conned the boat personally, making tiny corrections every few seconds. "Up 1 degree. Flood forward trim tank 200 pounds. Ease back to 4 knots. It took us 38 minutes to position ourselves over the Swordfish. Through the periscope, I could see her conning tower directly below us, maybe 40 feet down. The audience was motionless, absorbed. Once in position, we prepared the escape trunk. Torpedoman Second Class Robert Hayes and I would make the first dive, carrying communication lines and assessment equipment. The plan was simple: exit our trunk, swim down to the Swordfish, establish contact, then return with a status report before beginning the transfer. Grissom's hands moved as he spoke, unconsciously demonstrating the procedure. At 1700 hours, Hayes and I entered the escape trunk. Small space, maybe 4 feet in diameter, 7 feet tall. We wore Momsen lungs, primitive rebreather systems that gave us about 20 minutes of air. As the trunk flooded, pressure squeezed every airspace in your body. Your ears scream, your sinuses feel like they're collapsing. When the pressure equalized, we opened the outer hatch and swam down into the darkness. A female officer in the front row, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison from the engineering department, raised her hand. "How did you navigate to the Swordfish? Underwater visibility in the Pacific can't have been good. We followed a guide rope that Captain Atwood had already deployed using our deck gun crew. They'd weighted the line and dropped it to mark the Swordfish's position. Even so, visibility was maybe 10 feet. Everything beyond that was blue-black nothing." Grissom paused, remembering. "When we reached the Swordfish's hull, Hayes knocked 3 times on the pressure door. Immediately we heard a response, 3 knocks back. Someone was alive and aware inside. We signaled in Morse code by tapping, 'Barracuda here. Rescue attempt underway. Prepare escape trunk.' The auditorium held its collective breath. The response came quickly. 'Hull breach forward torpedo room. Escape trunk flooded. Cannot open inner hatch.' Then 3 more taps, slower. 71 souls aboard. 12 hours air remaining." The simple statement landed like a physical blow. Several recruits exchanged stricken looks. Our entire plan had been predicated on using their forward escape trunk. With it flooded and inaccessible, we had no way to extract the crew. Hayes and I surfaced back to the Barracuda and reported to Captain Atwood. I'll never forget his expression, not defeat but intense calculation. He was already working through alternatives. Grissom returned to the projector, switching to a different schematic. The Swordfish had a secondary escape trunk aft, near the engine room. But the torpedo damage had occurred in the stern section. We didn't know if that trunk was accessible or if the compartment was even habitable. Captain Atwood made the call immediately. "Grissom, Hayes, go back down. Make your way to the aft section and assess the situation." Lieutenant Nash spoke again. "That would require swimming the length of the submarine's exterior at depth." "How long would that take?" "In training, maybe 3 minutes. In reality, with limited visibility and unfamiliar terrain, closer to 8 or 9. Our mums and lungs wouldn't support that duration. We'd run out of air halfway back." "So how did you manage it?" asked Brighton, now sitting in the third row, with a notebook covered in detailed sketches. "Captain Atwood gave us additional air tanks, emergency reserves meant for our own escape in catastrophic failure. He was betting everything on this assessment dive. If we failed to reach the aft trunk, we'd have sacrificed equipment we might need to save our own crew." Grissom's voice took on a harder edge. "Hayes and I went back down at 17:45 hours. This time, we carried cutting torches, communication equipment, and emergency air supplies for the Swordfish crew. The swim along the Swordfish's hull was disorienting. You lose spatial awareness in the dark water. Your mind plays tricks, tells you you're swimming in circles or heading toward empty ocean," he demonstrated with his hands, showing the careful navigation method they'd used. "We counted hull rivets to track distance. Every 20 rivets, we'd stop and orient ourselves using the Swordfish's superstructure as reference. At one point, Hayes grabbed my arm and pointed upward. Through the murky water, I could make out a dark shape passing overhead. One of the Japanese destroyers had returned to the search area. The auditorium erupted in murmurs. Commander Hendricks leaned forward, riveted. We froze against the Swordfish's hull, trying to become part of the submarine. The destroyer's propeller wash created turbulence that slammed us against the metal plating. For 90 seconds, we didn't move. Then the sound faded, heading east. Grissom let the tension dissipate before continuing. We reached the aft section at 17:58 hours. The damage was extensive. A section of hull plating had been peeled back by the torpedo explosion, exposing internal compartments. Through the torn metal, we could see into the engine room. And that's when we discovered the real problem." He paused, letting the moment build. The aft escape trunk was intact and accessible, but the compartment had partially flooded. Not enough to equalize pressure with the outside ocean, but enough that anyone trying to use the escape trunk would have to swim through 15 feet of debris-filled. Pitch-black water just to reach the hatch. Paulson's voice carried disbelief. "With 71 men? Some probably injured. In the dark." Exactly the calculation Captain Atwood made when we reported back. We'd found a potential escape route, but using it would be extraordinarily dangerous. Men would panic in the flooded compartment. Equipment would fail. People would die, even in a successful rescue attempt. The room absorbed this grim reality. Lieutenant Marsh advocated for what he called a selective rescue. Evacuate the 20 men in the forward sections through the damaged hull. Leave the rest sealed in the dry compartments with emergency air supplies. Then surface and radio for specialized rescue equipment. Save some guaranteed, rather than risk losing everyone. "What did Captain Atwood say?" Sterling asked quietly. Grissom's expression softened slightly. He said, "We leave with all 71, or we leave with none." Then he asked me to calculate how many trips we'd need to evacuate the entire crew through the aft trunk, factoring in air consumption, physical exhaustion, and probability of equipment failure. What was your answer? I told him it was mathematically impossible. We'd need 6 hours minimum, and the Swordfish only had 12 hours of air when we started. We'd already burned 4 hours on assessment and positioning. Factor in the Japanese destroyer patrols, sweeping the area every 90 minutes. And the odds were catastrophically against success. The auditorium waited. Captain Atwood listened to my analysis, thanked me for the thorough assessment, then said, "We're doing it anyway. Start with the injured first, then the youngest crew members. We work until everyone's out or we can't continue. Prep the team." Grissom looked out over the audience, seeing his younger self in many of the faces. That's when I understood what command really means. It's not about making the smart choice or the safe choice. Sometimes it's about making the only choice your conscience allows, regardless of the odds. Captain Atwood knew we might fail. He knew we might lose both submarines. But he couldn't live with abandoning those men when any possibility of rescue existed. The silence in the auditorium was profound. At 1900 hours, we began the evacuation. What happened over the next 8 hours redefined everything I thought I knew about human endurance, courage, and submarine warfare. Tomorrow, I'll walk you through the rescue and why the techniques we improvised that night are still classified 42 years later. As the crowd filed out, the conversations were intense and focused. Officers debated Atwood's decision. Recruits argued about the ethics of risk versus reward. Chief Bellamy noticed that even the most senior instructors looked shaken by Grissom's account. Commander Hendricks approached the podium as Grissom collected his materials. I pulled the classified files on the Swordfish. Incident, she said quietly, cross-referenced with available Pacific Fleet records from March 1943. The mission occurred exactly as you described. What I can't find is any documentation of how you actually pulled off the rescue. Those sections are still redacted. Grissom met her eyes. Some things the Navy prefers to keep quiet, Commander. The methods we used. Let's just say they violated every safety protocol and operational procedure in existence. If word had spread, every submarine crew would have tried similar maneuvers, and most would have died in the attempt. But your crew didn't die. You saved 71 men. We saved 70, Grissom corrected softly. Tomorrow I'll tell them about the one we lost, and why his sacrifice matters more than the rescue itself. He left the auditorium, leaving Hendricks staring after him with a growing understanding of what those young men had truly accomplished in the dark waters of the Solomon Islands. By the fourth session, the auditorium couldn't accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. Commander Hendricks had arranged for a live audio feed to 2 overflow rooms. Naval personnel from across the training station had rearranged schedules to hear Grissom's continuation. He arrived to find the crowd already seated, conversations hushed. The anticipation was palpable. Yesterday, I told you, Captain Atwood made the decision to evacuate all 71 men from the Swordfish. Despite the mathematical improbability of success, Grissom began without preamble. What I didn't explain was how we actually accomplished it, or what it cost us. He clicked the projector, showing a hand-drawn diagram of the rescue configuration. The procedure we developed had never been attempted. Hayes and I would guide men from the Swordfish's flooded aft compartment through the damaged section to our waiting escape trunk. Each trip would take approximately 12 minutes, 4 minutes to reach the Swordfish, 3 minutes for the transfer, 5 minutes back to the Barracuda. Lieutenant Nash, who'd returned for this session, did the mental calculation. That's 5 men per hour maximum. For 71 men, you'd need over 14 hours. Correct. We had 8 hours of air remaining on the Swordfish, and Japanese patrols returning every 90 minutes. The math didn't work. Grissom's expression hardened. So we changed the math. He advanced to the next slide, showing a modified schematic. Chief Kimball proposed using our entire torpedo crew as guides. Instead of 2 men making repeated trips, we'd deploy 8 swimmers simultaneously. Each would escort a Swordfish crew member from their submarine to ours, then immediately return for the next man. The Barracuda would become a relay station. Men would enter through our escape trunk, move through the boat, and exit through our aft emergency hatch, which we'd rig as a secondary entry point. Kozlowski spoke up from the front row. That would mean keeping both hatches open simultaneously, with constant water flow through the submarine. Wouldn't that flood your own vessel? Under normal circumstances, yes. But Quartermaster Moretti calculated he could maintain neutral buoyancy if we continuously pumped ballast and kept the interior flow controlled. It would push our systems to the breaking point, but theoretically possible for short durations. The word theoretically hung in the air. Captain Atwood approved the plan at 19:30 hours. We had 6 hours until the Swordfish's air supply reached critical levels. 8 swimmers entered the water. Myself, Hayes, Chief Kimball, Torpedo Man First Class Daniel Webster, Seaman James Rafferty, and 3 others from our crew, Philip Durant, Kenneth Marsh and Arthur Coolidge. Grissom's voice took on a rhythmic quality as he described the operation. The first evacuee came through at 1947. Ours, a 19-year-old seaman from Iowa named Peter Callahan. He'd been injured in the initial torpedo strike, broken collarbone, barely conscious. Hayes and I guided him through the flooded compartment, through the torn hull section, up to our escape trunk. The entire transfer took 11 minutes. When we pulled him inside the Barracuda, he was hypothermic and barely breathing. But alive. The auditorium listened, transfixed. We sent him forward to the crew quarters, where our medical officer, Lieutenant Harold Jensen, had set up a triage station. Then Hayes and I immediately returned to the Swordfish for the next man. No rest, no recovery time. We became machines. Swim down, locate the next evacuee, guide them up, repeat. He paused, his hands gripping the podium edge. By 2100 hours, we'd evacuated 23 men. The system was working, but barely. Several swimmers were showing signs of exhaustion and nitrogen buildup from repeated deep dives. Seaman Rafferty surfaced during his 4th trip vomiting blood, pressure sickness. Captain Atwood pulled him from rotation, but that reduced our swimmer count to 7. Lieutenant Morrison called out, "What about the Japanese patrols? You mentioned they were sweeping the area regularly." At 21:34 hours, sonar picked up destroyer screws. Captain Atwood ordered all swimmers back to the Barracuda immediately. We had maybe 3 minutes before the destroyer's active sonar would paint both submarines. Chief Moretti executed an emergency ballast blow that lifted us off our position and moved us 200 yards east, leaving the Swordfish behind. The strategic necessity was clear, but the moral weight was crushing. We went silent again, drifting at 180 feet while the destroyer passed. Through the hull, we could hear her propellers, that high-pitched whine that every submariner learns to dread. She made 2 passes, active sonar pinging. Each ping echoed through our hull like a hammer strike. If she'd detected us, depth charges would have followed within seconds. Grissom's voice dropped lower. The destroyer lingered for 47 minutes. Every person aboard the Barracuda knew that 23 men were safely inside our hull, but 48 remained trapped on the Swordfish, their air supply diminishing with each passing minute. We couldn't move, couldn't help them. Couldn't do anything but wait and pray the destroyer would leave. The tension in the auditorium was visceral. At 22:21 hours, the destroyer's propeller noise faded to the northwest. Captain Atwood gave us 5 minutes to confirm she was truly gone, then ordered us back to position. By 22:30, we'd re-established our hover over the Swordfish, and swimmers were back in the water. He clicked to a new slide, showing a timeline of the rescue. The next 4 hours were the longest of my life. Trip after trip into the darkness, each time wondering if the man you were guiding would panic in the flooded compartment, if your air supply would hold, if another destroyer would appear. Torpedo Man Webster collapsed during his 8th trip, simply ran out of energy and couldn't continue. Captain Atwood pulled him from rotation. We were down to 6 swimmers. Paulson asked the question everyone was thinking. How did you keep going? Physically, that shouldn't have been possible. You're right, it shouldn't have been. But you discover reserves you didn't know existed when 71 lives depend on you. Chief Kimball developed a rhythm, timing his breathing to minimize air consumption. Hayes started using hand signals to communicate underwater, saving the energy required for tapping Morse code. We adapted, improvised, pushed beyond what training said was possible. Grissom's eyes scanned the audience. By 0200 hours, we'd evacuated 59 men. 12 remained on the Swordfish, including their captain, Commander Jack Brennan. Protocol dictated the captain would be the last man off his vessel. But Brennan had been coordinating the evacuation from inside the Swordfish, and we'd just received a message tapped through the hull. CO2 levels critical, men losing consciousness. Need immediate extraction." The auditorium was deathly quiet. Captain Atwood made a decision that would haunt him the rest of his life. He ordered us to bring out the 12 remaining men simultaneously. All 6 swimmers would guide 2 men each. It violated every safety procedure, increased the risk of panic and confusion. But it was the only way to get everyone out before they suffocated. Grissom's hands trembled slightly as he continued. At 02:15 hours, all 6 of us entered the Swordfish's aft compartment together. The scene inside was nightmarish. Men slumped against bulkheads, gasping for air that wasn't there. The emergency lighting had failed. We worked by flashlight in near-total darkness. Commander Brennan was still conscious, organizing his remaining crew for evacuation. He'd given his emergency air supply to a younger sailor. He stopped, composing himself. I took responsibility for Brennan and a young electrician's mate named Thomas Shaw. Hayes guided 2 others. Kimball, Durant, Rafferty, and Coolidge each grabbed their assigned pair. The plan was simple. We'd all swim out together, stay in visual contact, surface as a group. The silence stretched. We exited the Swordfish at 02:19 hours. 12 survivors, 6 guides, all swimming upward through the darkness toward the Barracuda's waiting escape trunk. For the first 30 seconds, everything went according to plan. Then Shaw's emergency rebreather failed. Several people in the audience inhaled sharply. He panicked immediately. Natural reaction when your air supply cuts off at 200 feet. He thrashed, kicked, tried to rip off his breathing apparatus. I grabbed him, tried to share my air supply, but he was beyond rational thought. Fear had taken over completely. Grissom's voice became almost mechanical, pushing through the memory. Commander Brennan saw what was happening. He swam over, pulled Shaw away from me, and gave the young man his own rebreather. Then Brennan made eye contact with me through his dive mask. I saw the decision in his eyes before he made it. He gave me a thumbs up, the signal that he was okay, then pushed Shaw toward the surface and sank back down into the darkness. The auditorium erupted in shocked murmurs. I tried to follow him, but Shaw was flailing, pulling me upward. By the time I got Shaw into the Barracuda's escape trunk and turned back, Brennan was gone. We searched for 40 minutes, but at that depth, in that visibility, a single man disappears completely. Captain Atwood finally ordered us to terminate the search. Grissom's composure cracked slightly. We'd saved 70 men from the Swordfish, but we'd lost Commander Jack Brennan, who sacrificed himself so a 19-year-old electrician's mate could live. That's the man I think about 42 years later. Not the successful rescue, not the impossible odds we overcame. I think about a captain who gave his life for his crew, and whether I could have done more to save him. The room remained silent for a long moment. Shaw survived. He went on to serve on 4 more submarines, earned a Bronze Star in the Philippines campaign, became a chief petty officer, and raised 3 daughters. He died in 1981, having lived 38 years that wouldn't have existed without Brennan's sacrifice. Was that trade worth it? I don't know. Brennan's wife didn't think so when I visited her after the war. His 2 sons didn't think so, but Shaw's daughters exist because of that decision. Commander Hendricks wiped at her eyes, not bothering to hide the gesture. "Tomorrow," Grissom said quietly, "I'll tell you what happened after the rescue, and why the Navy buried this story so deep that most of you have never heard of the Swordfish or the Barracuda." Dismissed. Nobody moved immediately. Then slowly 1 person in the back row stood, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium rose in silent respect, not applause, but something deeper, recognition of sacrifice that transcended tactics and technology. Grissom gathered his materials and walked toward the exit. Brighton caught up to him in the hallway. "Sir, I need to ask, is Thomas Shaw's family aware of what Commander Brennan did?" Shaw made sure of it. He visited Brennan's widow every year until she passed away in 1969, set up a scholarship fund in Brennan's name, made his daughters promise to tell their children the story. Some debts can never be repaid, but Shaw spent his entire life trying. As Brighton walked away, Chief Bellamy approached. "The recruits are different now," he observed. They look at you differently. At the service differently. Grissom nodded slowly. They're understanding what their textbooks can't teach them. That submarine warfare isn't about technology or tactics. It's about the decisions you make when there are no good options, and the people who pay the price for those decisions. One more session, Bellamy said. What else is there to tell? Grissom's expression darkened slightly. The part that explains why I'm here 42 years later, teaching recruits who laughed at my stories. The part where I tell them what Captain Atwood ordered me to do, and why I've regretted following that order every day since. The final session drew an even larger crowd than before. Officers from other naval installations had traveled to hear Grissom's conclusion. The overflow rooms were packed, and additional personnel gathered in the corridors to listen through open doors. Grissom entered into complete silence. No shuffling papers, no whispered conversations. Just expectant faces waiting for the final piece of a story that had transformed how they understood their service. We surfaced the Barracuda at 0340 hours on March 22nd, 1943, he began. 70 men from the Swordfish were crammed into spaces designed for 63. The air was thick enough to cut, and most of the rescued crew were suffering from hypothermia, shock, or injuries sustained during the torpedo attack. But they were alive. He didn't use the projector this time. The story needed no visual aids. Captain Atwood set course away from the area at maximum speed. We'd been in Japanese-controlled waters for nearly 20 hours, and our luck couldn't hold much longer. At 0600 hours, we crash-dived to avoid a patrol aircraft. At 1200 hours, we detected destroyer propellers and went silent for another 3 hours. The rescued Swordfish crew experienced what we lived with every day, the constant awareness that death could arrive without warning. Grissom walked slowly across the front of the auditorium. We reached safe waters on March 24th and rendezvoused with the destroyer USS Fletcher. They transferred the Swordfish survivors and provided us with supplies. That should have been the end of the story. Miraculous rescue, tragic loss, return to patrol. But as the Fletcher pulled away, Captain Atwood received an encrypted message from Pacific Fleet Command. His voice took on a harder edge. I was in the wardroom when Atwood called his senior officers together, Lieutenant Marsh, Chief Kimball, and myself. He read the message aloud. Swordfish rescue mission classified top secret. All personnel involved prohibited from discussing operational details. Official record will state Swordfish lost with all hands. No survivors, no rescue. Recommend appropriate decorations be filed under sealed authorization. The auditorium erupted in confused murmurs. Commander Hendricks leaned forward, her expression intense. We couldn't believe what we were hearing, Grissom continued. 70 men were alive because of what we'd done. Commander Brennan had died to make that rescue possible. And Pacific Fleet Command wanted to erase it all, pretend it never happened. Brighton's voice cut through the noise. Why would they do that? Captain Atwood asked the same question. The response came 3 hours later, this time from Admiral Chester Nimitz himself. Rescue technique violates every established safety protocol. If operational details become public, submarine crews throughout the Pacific will attempt similar maneuvers. Most will fail. Estimated casualties from copycat rescue attempts, 600 men minimum. Cannot allow this precedent. Mission remains classified indefinitely. The logic was brutal and undeniable. Admiral Nimitz was right, Grissom said quietly. What we accomplished required perfect conditions, exceptional personnel, and extraordinary luck. The next crew that tried it would probably die. The crew after that, and the one after that. Our success would inspire failures that would kill hundreds of submariners. Lieutenant Morrison spoke up. But you saved 70 lives. That has to count for something. It did count. Privately, every man on the Barracuda received commendations that were filed in classified records. Captain Atwood was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the recommendation was sealed. The Swordfish survivors were transferred to different submarines, scattered across the Pacific Fleet, ordered never to discuss what happened. Some of them I never saw again. Grissom's hands gripped the podium. The part that destroyed Captain Atwood came next. Admiral Nimitz ordered him to recommend a cover story for Commander Brennan's death. We couldn't say he died during the rescue because officially there was no rescue. We needed a plausible explanation for how a submarine captain was killed in action. The room held its breath. Captain Atwood spent 2 days composing that report. I watched him write and rewrite it, trying to find words that honored Brennan's sacrifice without revealing the truth. Finally, he submitted a classified document stating that Commander Brennan was killed during a depth charge attack while engaging a Japanese convoy. Heroic action, appropriate for a submarine commander. A complete fabrication. Grissom's voice cracked slightly. Then Admiral Nimitz gave Atwood one more order. The Barracuda was to return to the coordinates where the Swordfish had gone down. We were to fire 3 torpedoes into the wreck, ensuring it broke apart and sank beyond any salvage depth. The Navy couldn't risk Japanese forces discovering the Swordfish intact and learning about the rescue technique we'd developed. Sterling's voice was barely audible. You had to destroy the submarine you'd just saved 70 men from. We fired those torpedoes on March 28, 1943. I was the torpedo officer. I calculated the firing solution myself. 3 Mark 14 torpedoes, spread pattern, direct hits on the Swordfish's hull. I watched through the periscope as she broke apart and slid down the underwater slope, disappearing into the depths where no one would ever find her. The weight of that action settled over the auditorium like a physical presence. Captain Atwood never forgave himself for any of it. Not the cover story, not destroying the Swordfish, not the lie that Commander Brennan's family had to believe. He completed 2 more war patrols, received a Navy Cross for actions that had nothing to do with the Swordfish rescue, then requested transfer to a training command stateside. After the war, he resigned his commission and moved to Montana. I visited him once, in 1963. He'd become a high school teacher, never mentioned his Navy service to anyone. He died in 1971. Grissom paused, gathering himself. I stayed in the Navy until 1958, made commander, served on 4 more submarines. Every time I conducted a drill or reviewed a tactical procedure, I thought about that night in March 1943, about the rules we'd broken, the risks we'd taken, and whether Captain Atwood's decision to attempt the rescue had been right or reckless. He looked directly at the recruits in the front rows. That's why I'm here, 42 years later, teaching history to people who laughed at my war stories. Because you need to understand something your textbooks and simulators can't teach you. The technology will change. The weapons will evolve. But the fundamental challenge of submarine warfare remains constant. You'll face situations where every option is bad, where following the rules means abandoning your people, and where breaking the rules might kill everyone. Commander Hendricks stood, drawing attention to the back of the auditorium. Mr. Grissom, I need to add something to your account. Last week, I submitted a request to Pacific Fleet Command for declassification of the Swordfish rescue mission. This morning, I received their response. She held up a document. After 42 years, the Navy has agreed to partially declassify the mission. The rescue will be entered into official records. Commander Brennan's family will be informed of his actual cause of death, and the Medal of Honor recommendation for Captain Atwood will be reviewed for posthumous award. The 70 survivors will have their service records amended to reflect their experience. Grissom stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. Additionally, Hendricks continued, Pacific Fleet Command has authorized the development of a new submarine rescue protocol based on techniques pioneered during the Swordfish operation. Modern technology has made those procedures significantly safer. Your mission is no longer a classified failure to be hidden, Mr. Grissom. It's now recognized as one of the most significant rescue operations in naval history. The auditorium exploded in applause. Not polite recognition, but thunderous appreciation that shook the walls. Recruits, officers, instructors, all standing, acknowledging not just Grissom, but the crew of the Barracuda and the sacrifice of Commander Brennan. Grissom's eyes glistened, but he maintained composure. When the applause finally subsided, Brighton approached the podium with a question. "Sir, if you could go back to that moment when Captain Atwood asked for volunteers to attempt the rescue, knowing everything that followed, the success, the cover-up, the destruction of the swordfish, the 42 years of secrecy, would you still volunteer?" Grissom considered the question carefully. "Every single time, Recruit Brighton. Because 70 men lived who would have died. Because Thomas Shaw raised 3 daughters who had children of their own. Because submarine crews throughout the fleet learned, even if they didn't know the specifics, that the Navy doesn't abandon its people. The cost was high and the burden was heavy, but the alternative was unconscionable." He gathered his materials one final time. "You came to these sessions expecting war stories, tales of torpedo runs and dramatic battles. What I gave you instead was something more important, the truth about what command actually means. It means making decisions that will haunt you forever. It means carrying secrets that eat at your soul. It means understanding that sometimes the right choice and the legal choice aren't the same thing." Grissom looked at each section of the auditorium in turn. "In a few months, some of you will serve on submarines. You'll have technology Captain Atwood couldn't have imagined, but you'll face the same fundamental question he faced. What are you willing to risk to bring your people home? I hope you never have to answer that question under the conditions we faced. But if you do, I hope you have the courage to make the hard choice. Live with the consequences and trust that eventually the truth will vindicate your decision." He walked toward the exit, then paused at the door. "One more thing. Recruit Brighton, Paulson, Kozlowski, Sterling, the 4 of you who wrote the most thoughtful analyses of Captain Atwood's initial decision. Report to Commander Hendricks tomorrow at 800. She's arranging for you to speak with 3 of the swordfish survivors. They're elderly now, scattered across the country, but they've agreed to video calls. They want to thank the next generation of submariners for honoring their story. They know about these sessions." Paulson asked, surprised. "I contacted them last week. Told them it was time their story was heard, even if the Navy wasn't ready to make it official yet." Turns out Commander Hendricks thought the same thing. He nodded respectfully toward her. "Sometimes the best way to change bad policy is to make it irrelevant." As Grissom left the auditorium, the crowd remained standing. Chief Bellamy approached Commander Hendricks. "That request for declassification, when did you actually submit it?" "The day after his first session," she admitted. "I knew within 10 minutes of listening to him that this story needed to be told. The Navy agreed, though it took some convincing. Grissom's account was so detailed, so verifiable, that keeping it classified served no purpose except protecting an obsolete policy decision. He's changed this entire training station in 5 days, Bellamy observed. Recruits are asking different questions, thinking differently about their service. Even the senior instructors are reconsidering how they teach submarine warfare." Hendricks smiled slightly. "That's what happens when you stop treating history as a collection of dates and tactics and start treating it as a record of human decisions under impossible pressure. Grissom didn't teach them submarine warfare. He taught them submarine command. There's a profound difference." In the corridor outside, Brighton caught up with Grissom one final time. "Sir, I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I said before. When you first walked into that lecture hall, I saw an old man with outdated stories. I was wrong. Thank you for showing us what service really means." Grissom placed a hand on the young recruit's shoulder. "You weren't wrong to question me, Brighton. Skepticism is healthy in a submariner. But I hope you've learned to distinguish between questioning the messenger and dismissing the message. The difference could save your life someday, or the lives of your crew." As Brighton walked away, Grissom stood alone in the empty corridor. 42 years of carrying that story, and finally it had found the audience that needed to hear it. Not for glory, not for recognition, but to ensure that the next generation understood the true weight of the dolphins they would wear on their uniforms. Commander Brennan's sacrifice would no longer be hidden behind classification stamps and fabricated reports. The crew of the Barracuda would receive the recognition they'd earned, and Captain Raymond Atwood's impossible decision would stand as a testament to what leadership actually requires. The old submariner smiled faintly, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the exit. His mission, the one that had brought him back to the Navy after 27 years of civilian life, was complete. Behind him, in the auditorium, recruits stayed behind to discuss what they'd learned. The laughter that had greeted Grissom's first appearance was gone, replaced by understanding that would shape their service for decades to come. Some lessons, it turned out, were worth waiting 42 years to teach. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.